Let's go on to the second stage, and we discussed that that's going to be exploration. And let's start with you, Camilla. Take us through sort of what is the exploration stage and what are you doing now? Now that you've become curious, you have your question, what do you do with that question?
So in the exploration stage, basically this is where we actually dig a lot deeper into the question and understand the so what behind it. So if we have the question such as, do active Canadians have what they need in their breakfast cereal? And Loretta's done all the nutrition elements of it, has led us down kind of sports nutrition, food credentials that we need. We then dig even deeper and explore even further to understand the whys behind it. And why is this important? We dig deep to understand the consumer insights and to uncover these consumer insights that help us bring the product to life and help us bring it to market.
Okay, now you've used the word consumer insight. I'm going to stop you there, sorry. I need to understand, what's a consumer insight?
So a consumer insight, there isn't one standard definition of a consumer insight. And the reason being is it's constantly changing and it's evolving, and it's like using one definition to describe people. A consumer insight is a true, deep understanding of consumer needs, consumer wants, behaviors, attitudes, just really understanding what they do and why they do it. Some key elements in a consumer insight is that deep understanding, but also uncovering kind of the unknown or the forgotten or that aha moment to truly understand why people do what they do. Another key element of a consumer insight is there should be a clear role for the food or the brand for the consumer. Like I can find a consumer insight, but if there's no role for the food and it doesn't meet the need, you can't really action it, you can't really do anything with it. So it's really, there's a connection between the consumer and the brand. And lastly, the key thing about a consumer insight is it's the words of the consumer. It's not me, the marketer, or the nutrition, or the innovations team speaking. It's the words of the consumer. It's something that they would say out of their mouth. And it gets kind of that little gut reaction for them. And when we start mining for consumer insights, we always have those things in mind. But a key element, we talked about trends earlier and what's happening in culture, is cultural insights also impact the consumer insight.
So then, what's the difference between a cultural insight and a consumer insight?
Okay, so a consumer insight is basically about the person, about the individual, about the person that's going to eat our food and why they're doing it, or what are their needs, their wants, their attitudes, behaviors. The cultural insights is about the environment that we live in and what's happening around us and the trends that we're following. Typically, a consumer insight will follow a cultural insight. A person will behave because of what's happening in culture. Right, so for the example, if I refer back to the vector example that we're using, we saw this cultural insight or cultural trend that was happening of consumers were becoming much more active. From having that cultural insight, we then started mining, well, what's the consumer insight behind that? So why are they doing that? What's driving that behavior?
So then how did you use all of this to sort of come up with where you were going to develop the vector product? How did you then, what was the insight you found?
So what we found was, so when you were looking at sports nutrition and for active Canadians, and once we started mining and understanding these consumers and their activities, we realized there was a couple of different insights, a couple of different paths that we can take. What we kind of found was there was this everyday kind of athlete out there that was kind of active, but they were doing it on a regular basis. Once we started digging deeper and truly understanding who these consumers were, like getting face-to-face with them and observing them and talking to them, we realized that we weren't looking at your kind of average, everyday, active person. We were looking more of those active Canadians that were ambitious. They had a goal. They were doing it for a reason. We mined in terms of why they were doing it. We want to understand who they were and pretty much kind of profiling these individuals. Basically, very simple demographic profiles like age and gender, but also their attitudes towards sports nutrition, their attitudes towards activity. And what we did was we found these group of consumers where the product would fit in to meet their needs that we pretty much called ambitious actives.
So ambitious actives, those were the consumers you were going after.
That's right. They were the target for the food that we were developing. They were the consumers that were most relevant for this new vector product. And at this point, vector didn't exist. It's still just an idea, and we're still just exploring to identify what it is that these consumers want that they don't have right now that we can actually produce and create for them.
So you use this term ambitious actives. So what kind of tools or ideas, or how did you find or define these people? Take me through that.
There isn't one single tool or technique that we would use. It's usually a multiple set of tools and techniques. Some examples would be watching them in situations, so going to the gym and watching them work out and talking to them afterwards, or going to a sporting event that they're attending or participating in and talking to them afterwards. Attending focus groups and talking to them within kind of a more structured environment. We would read the magazines that they were reading in order to become informed. We spoke to nutrition experts and sports experts, truly to understand why these ambitious actives were what their attitudes and beliefs were, not only for themselves personally in their activity, but also to understand what they needed from their food and what they needed to stay active. And what we found was with these ambitious actives was they were very active, they participated in events, but they weren't athletes. They weren't competitive. They had a goal that they wanted to meet, and it was their own personal goal, and it was about exceeding what they did last time. So they were very ambitious in that sense. So they were run the marathon. It wasn't about finishing first. It was just finishing better than they did last time. And they understood that the food that they ate was essential to make sure they had the endurance that they needed to finish the marathon and to beat their personal best. But they also were challenged because of the food that was up there, their sports nutrition food for them, didn't actually taste so great. And they did not want to forego taste because they weren't these professional, hardcore
They're not
athletes.
our Olympic athletes.
No.
No.
So they were you're still average people, but they had ambitions and they had goals that they were meeting. So they didn't want to forego taste. The other thing we found was that they wanted recognizable food. So most of this nutrition was offered in powders or in gels or in weird bottles and stuff.
Must have been very foreign to them. They didn't want that.
They didn't want that. They wanted that. They still considered themselves the average person that had these ambitions, but they wanted the food that was recognizable, which was a great place for Vector to be because we offered breakfast cereal. And how much more recognizable can you get is breakfast cereal. So we really honed in on who they were and what they were looking for and why they were looking for it.
And just one more question before I go over to Loretta. When you say they were ambitious actives, did they describe themselves as that, or is that sort of your description of them?
Now, that was a description we used internally to kind of ground us in who our target was. So it wasn't the everyday active person. It was somebody who was active but had goals and who was ambitious. So it was a simple term that we came up with so we can visualize who the vector target was and who the vector consumer was.
So Loretta, now that we understand that's the target and that's the description and that's sort of, in this whole area, that's who marketing has zoned in on, what did you do with this sort of target from a nutrition perspective? How did you sort of explore this now that you understand where marketing's going after these ambitious actives, if you will?
Well, here's where our role was to explore how to get the product based on this science that we found out, based in sports nutrition, to meet this consumer need of the ambitious actives. How can we get that product to market, or how can we get the consumer need to market? And in looking and considering getting a product to market, one of the key areas to look at is the regulatory environment, because the regulations determine what you can and can't do with a product, what can go into the product, what you can say about the product. So as we learned from marketing, ambitious actives wanted the nutrition of sports nutrition of athletes, but in a more consumer-friendly and familiar format. So we looked at the sports nutrition science together with the existing regulations, the cereal regulations. And we found that the cereal regulations wouldn't be able to meet that need. It wouldn't allow for the nutrients to be added to the product that were important in the sports nutrition science.
So hearing that, I'm sure marketing wasn't very happy.
No.
So
And we had to keep then exploring, okay.
Right.
And you know, this is where we dug deeper and, as they say, maybe looked outside of the box.
as opposed to in the box.
And this is kind of where our aha moment came, because in combing the regulations, looking through the regulations, we discovered that if we used the meal replacement regulations, which is not cereals, but the meal replacement regulations, that we could achieve the nutrient needs of sports nutrition. But if only we could come up with then a product format that the ambitious active consumer would be comfortable with.
So, I mean, when you say you're combing the regulations, in my mind, I have this vision of you and the nutrition team at Kellogg's with all of the food and drug regs. Is someone just going through like this and reading them?
That's basically what we did, you know, explore, and dig, and there's, you know, what can we do here, knowing that we couldn't go the first route when we started to look at our more natural product
So
placement.
who had or how did the idea come up like, oh, meal replacement? How could we use that?
In essence, that was the nutrition function and the regulatory function, looking at the regulations and what they enabled. So, in essence, at this point, we had our first step accomplished to getting a product to market. We had to determine the regulatory category that the product would be sold under, and we decided that then we would deliver a meal replacement in a flaked format, if only it could be done.
So this had not been done before?
No, it hadn't. And the meal replacement regulations are very complex and technical. Important point here is that the regulatory category defines the product just from a regulatory perspective. So just to ensure that the product is made according to the regulations, what must be in it, it must comply with the regulations. But not from a consumer perspective. From a consumer perspective, the important thing is the product delivering to meet my needs? So is it delivering to meet this insight on getting the nutrients of sports nutrition in a familiar product format?
So the regulations really aren't that known to the consumer. It's just the vehicle of getting the nutrients out to meet the consumer need. But the consumer doesn't. That's all behind the scenes. It's really meeting that consumer need. So this must have been very interesting when you have all these regulatory issues and knowledge on one side, and then you've got the marketing consumer insight on the other. Having these two areas work together must have been rather interesting, because the language and the lexicon of both of these disciplines is very different. So how do you guys work together from a regulatory and a marketing? How do you speak the same language?
Yeah, there was huge learning on both sides. Just as much as I had to learn what a consumer insight was, marketing had to understand the regulations that we were working under. And we almost had to learn each other's lens, and the lens we were each working under, almost in the same way as in clinical practice, doctors and dietitians need to know the lens that they're each working under in order to deliver their patient care needs.
Wow.
And
Go
yeah,
ahead.
we certainly had a concerted effort with marketing to help them understand the meal replacement regulations, but not just so that we're compliant to the regulations, but it really is that is the regulation that enabled marketing to get their consumer need to market.
Right. So the
product.
consumer is actually, it sounds like, is the leader in this whole process. They define what they want, and through the insight and the regulations, we try to deliver it. Very interesting. So now I'm just wondering if we run out to Chris again. Dr. Chris, do you have any questions that have been brought forward on this whole area of exploration?
I have a few questions here. My first question is for Loretta. Loretta, you talked about using guidelines and regulations, and as you know, recommendations for nutrients are always changing. They can be plastic, and a good example of that is vitamin D. So to develop a new product, how do you address barriers in fortification regulations, for example?
Wow, that's interesting. So, just to maybe summarize that a little bit, there's a lot of different regulations out there and barriers that, as we know, marketing wants to do something, the regulations may not help. So how do we sort of work to get regulations to support where the science obviously supports it, but it meets a consumer need.
That's a very, very good point, because we do need to work within the existing regulations. But the process of setting policy and regulation is a bit slower term than sometimes some of the questions that we're getting and the things that consumers are asking us that we need. So it is difficult to have the regulations to keep up with the science, and in some cases we might approach government or might explore a little bit more ourselves what we could do on our own. But certainly, yes, the regulations are always a little bit behind the science, and we need to work within the current ones.
Right. And I'm just thinking when you said, you know, that there's the regulation and there's the science and then the policy, and to your point, many times that science is kind of ahead of the regulations, and we have to go and deal and talk to government to say, hey, here's some new science, maybe we should look at, is this regulation really reflective of the current science?
Or we can't always respond so quickly to the consumer need because the regulations don't allow that.
Are slower, right. Okay, so Chris, any other questions that we have out there?
I think both panelists could probably comment on this one. Obviously, Canada is multicultural. How do you adjust for cultural differences in product development or cultural differences in insights?
Wow, that's yes, very good. I think maybe we'll, interesting question, maybe we'll start with you, Camilla, because you're probably looking at all the different cultures in Canada from a consumer research perspective.
Yeah, so we definitely take it into consideration, and it depends on what it is that we want to launch to market or bring to market, and how much of that cultural or ethnic communities we mine into. So if we were launching something specific for a specific cultural group, then we would probably follow the same kind of process that we're following here. We start with curiosity and start asking questions about them to get to ideas. Then we get into exploration, understand them deeper and closer, and understand their different taste profiles and preferences towards different taste
So would you
profiles.
then have consumer research groups with that particular cultural
that particular
demographic?
Group. That's right. So it depends on what it is that we're launching. It changes the individuals that we talk to. It changes those that we're observing. And those individuals will have different needs. That's why we really target in those ones that we are building the product for. You can't make food that's going to meet everybody's needs. You are making food to meet specific needs. So you go through the same process. You start with curiosity and find out what's the idea, where do we want to start mining. You start exploring, you have to test it, you have to validate it, and then you introduce it to them.
And Loretta, do you have a comment on
Yes,
that?
well, I think from the nutrition world, a related example might be an obesity and body weight management, where the consumer insight is, you know, I'm eating too much or I'm not exercising enough. But then the cultural insight that comes into that, you know, is the built environment, how close someone lives to a grocery store, family influences, do they know cooking skills, and do they know how to cook? So the product itself might meet one of those needs, but there's other elements that we deliver with the product to help get at some of those different cultural factors and where the product's made available or how to use the product.